In November of 1986, the City Council of Paramount, California, voted to rename the stretch of road that ran through their town. It had been called Compton Boulevard, named for the neighboring city just to the west, and it had carried that name for decades, linking 7 cities across 17 miles of Los Angeles County. The council chose Somerset Boulevard instead. The developer Kaufman and Broad, about to build 128 houses in Paramount, had suggested the name. Their reasoning was not complicated. They wanted buyers, and buyers did not want to live on a street named after Compton. Within 2 years, 4 more cities followed. Gardena, Lawndale, Hawthorne, and Redondo Beach all swapped Compton Boulevard for Marine Avenue, aligning themselves with the affluent, predominantly white Manhattan Beach instead. Each city council denied that race had anything to do with it. Marine Avenue, they argued, was a more fitting name for a road that led toward the Pacific Ocean, though that logic didn't quite explain why inland Gardena or Hawthorne felt the same pull toward the sea. By 1989, Compton Boulevard existed only inside Compton. And here's the thing that makes this story unlike any other American city's story. In the exact same years that neighboring towns were sandblasting Compton's name off their street signs, a group of 5 young men from that city were about to make the word Compton one of the most recognized place names on earth. The album they released on August 8, 1988, wedged right between Paramount's vote and Gardena's, was called Straight Outta Compton. It went double platinum. It made the city's name a global brand of danger, defiance, and despair. So the same 4 syllables were being scrubbed from maps and screamed from speakers, erased from one America and burned into the consciousness of another, all at the same time, within a few miles of the same flat, sun-blasted grid of streets. How does that happen to a place? How does a Methodist farming colony founded in 1867 become, within a single century, the city whose name is both too toxic for a street sign and too potent for any rapper to resist? The answer isn't one catastrophe. It's a sequence of doors, opened and shut by specific people at specific moments for specific financial reasons, each one sealing the previous one's consequences into place. The man the city is named for never lived to see any of it. Griffith Dickinson Compton was a Methodist temperance man from Illinois who led 30 pioneer families overland to Southern California in 1867. They had been on their way to Sacramento, but the Sierra Nevada crossing looked too brutal, so they turned south and settled on a piece of the old Rancho San Pedro, a vast Spanish land grant from 1784 that had once belonged to the Dominguez family. Before either the Spanish or the Americans, the Tongva people had lived in the basin for centuries. Their presence was not a footnote, but a prologue that neither Compton nor his followers ever acknowledged. The soil was sandy loam, fertile and easy to work. The climate was mild. Compton and his group put up a schoolhouse that doubled as a church, planted crops, and established a post office by August of 1869. A newspaper, the Los Angeles Star, noted that the settlement, sometimes called Gibsonville, sometimes Comptonville, had even laid out a 10-acre cemetery, which the paper hoped would go unused for a good long while. It was, by all accounts, an orderly, God-fearing place. Compton himself was a delegate to the statewide Prohibition Convention of 1892 and a founding trustee of the University of Southern California. By 1882, he'd moved away, north to a fine house near the campus, on the corner of Jefferson and Hoover, a spot now occupied by a USC parking lot. He left his name on the settlement but took himself elsewhere, which turned out to be a pattern the city would see again and again. The settlement he left behind incorporated as a city on May 11, 1888, with 500 residents and an immediate governance problem. Just 2 years later, voters decided to shed most of the city's territory, shrinking from roughly 600 acres to 80. The population dropped so low, 5 registered voters, that the municipal government couldn't function. The city marshal and the other elected officials even donated 4 months' salary to cover a budget shortfall so the city could purchase 4 fire hydrants. Then governance lapsed entirely. The Los Angeles County Sheriff stepped in, and Compton drifted for about 15 years with effectively no local government at all. It wasn't until 1906 that the city reconstituted itself and began to grow again. What gave it an economic foothold that most small California towns lacked was geography. Compton sat at the center of Los Angeles County, roughly equidistant between downtown Los Angeles to the north and the Port of Long Beach to the south, and the Los Angeles and San Pedro Railroad ran directly through it. Farmers could get crops to the harbor or to the city market in a single morning. It earned the nickname Hub City, and for the next several decades, that's all it was, a small agricultural center, unremarkable, sitting at the crossroads of other people's commerce. Then, the earth moved. At 5:54 in the evening on March 10th, 1933, a magnitude 6.4 earthquake struck the Newport-Inglewood Fault, directly beneath the region. The epicenter was offshore near Huntington Beach, but the damage concentrated in the places built on the softest ground, deep, water-soaked alluvium and sandy fill. Compton, sitting on exactly that kind of soil, was devastated. Main Street, the commercial spine of the little city, collapsed. Schools crumbled. Cars were crushed under falling masonry. Across the broader region, 120 people died and property damage reached $40 million. In 1933 money. Compton's entire business district was wrecked. A photograph from the next morning shows the Fargo Coffee and Tea Company building on Main Street split open like a broken crate, debris spilling into the road, a crane working in the distance. This is the first door. Because Compton rebuilt, the city took on bonds to finance a new downtown, modern commercial buildings, reinforced to the new earthquake codes that California rushed into law after the disaster. The Field Act, passed just a month after the quake, mandated that every school in the state meet structural safety standards, and Compton's demolished schools were among the chief reasons the law existed. A new city hall went up at 600 North Alameda Street. Compton Junior College, established in 1927, expanded. A municipal airport opened, the Compton Airport, later called Compton/Woodley, a small field on the city's north side that would quietly operate for decades, one of the few general aviation airports in the inner ring of Los Angeles County. For the next 15 years, the city grew slowly and steadily, still overwhelmingly agricultural, still overwhelmingly white, still Methodist in temperament, if no longer strictly Methodist in population. The bonds, of course, would come due eventually. Nobody worried much about that yet. By the late 1940s, Compton was transforming. The war had ended. California's defense industries had drawn millions of workers west, and now those workers needed houses. The farmland around Compton gave way to tract housing, neat rows of modest, single-family homes with small yards, built fast and sold cheap to veterans and industrial workers pouring into the Alameda Corridor, the industrial artery that ran along the railroad tracks from downtown Los Angeles south through Compton to the port. The population climbed past 30,000. Industrial growth surged along that same corridor. Warehouses, light manufacturing, distribution centers, the kind of blue-collar infrastructure that a suburban city could build a tax base on. And here, briefly, a remarkable thing. In 1949, a young Yale graduate named George Herbert Walker Bush moved to Compton with his wife Barbara and their 3-year-old son, George W. Bush. The elder Bush was selling oil drilling equipment for a Dresser Industries subsidiary, working temporary assignments across Southern California. They lived in an apartment at 624 South Santa Fe Avenue. Their daughter Pauline was born while they were there. The Bushes stayed only 6 months before moving on to Texas, where the family's fortune and political dynasty would take root. The apartment building where 2 future presidents once lived was demolished in 2002. The Compton that the Bush family knew was, as historian Josh Sides has put it, exclusively white with an extraordinary web of racially restrictive covenants with a very aggressive policing strategy about keeping black people out. Those covenants had been formally adopted in 1921, written into property deeds across the city, barring African Americans and other people of color from purchasing or renting. Civic leaders, real estate agents, banks, and the local police all enforced the system. Before World War II, Compton was 95% white, a Republican Party stronghold with a significant Mormon population. The city wasn't unusual in this. Restrictive covenants covered much of suburban America. What made Compton's version notable was its thoroughness. There was no equivocation. The walls were high, and for decades they held. What brought them down was a real estate agent from Louisiana, a Supreme Court ruling, and the oldest force in the American economy, the opportunity to make money selling houses to people who desperately wanted to buy them. In 1946, 2 years before the Supreme Court acted, a woman named Velma Grant, a black real estate agent whom the renowned black architect Paul Revere Williams called that dynamo of a woman, developed a small residential neighborhood on the northwest border of Compton in the unincorporated area known as Willowbrook. It was called George Washington Carver Manor, and Williams himself designed the homes. It wasn't technically inside Compton city limits, but it was right at the edge. Then, in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelley versus Kramer that racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable. The legal wall around Compton, around all of white suburban America, shattered overnight. What happened next was driven not by idealism, but by profit. White developers, seeing an enormous untapped market of middle-class black families who had been trapped for decades in the overcrowded neighborhoods of South Central Los Angeles, began buying land in Compton, building new houses, and selling them to black buyers at a premium. At the same time, other real estate agents practiced what would become known as blockbusting, going door to door in white neighborhoods, warning homeowners that black families were moving in, that property values were about to collapse, that they'd better sell now while they still could. The agents bought the houses cheap from panicked white sellers and flipped them to black buyers at inflated prices. It was a machine for extracting money from fear on one side and hope on the other. The first black families who crossed into Compton's white neighborhoods found exactly what you'd expect them to find: paint smeared on their homes, flower gardens uprooted, crosses burned on their lawns. A white gang called the Spook Hunters, the name itself a racial slur, patrolled the streets and tried to keep black residents indoors after 5 in the afternoon. This is a detail worth pausing on. The first gangs in Compton were white. They were not formed in response to drugs or poverty. They were formed to maintain a racial boundary, and they operated with the tacit support of local law enforcement, who had spent decades enforcing the same boundary through legal means. By the late 1950s, black students began enrolling at Compton High School, and the friction boiled into violence. The Spook Hunters clashed with the Huns, a black street gang from South Los Angeles, in what amounted to Compton's first race riot, but the trajectory was set. The black population, which had been 5% in 1940, hit 40% by 1960. There was, as Sides describes it, a narrow window, roughly 1952 to 1965, when blacks and whites coexisted in Compton with something approaching peace. Ellis Cook, who moved to Compton in 1962, remembered it as a time when there was still open space in the city, when he could go horseback riding for 5 hours on a Saturday morning. Downtown Compton in those years was packed on weekends, especially during the holidays. The shops did brisk business. The streets were alive. That window closed on August 11, 1965, not in Compton itself, but a few miles north, in Watts. The Watts Rebellion, 6 days of violent unrest, sparked by a traffic stop on a hot summer evening, a California Highway Patrol officer pulling over a young black motorist named Marquette Fry, and fueled by decades of police brutality and economic deprivation, killed 34 people, injured over 1,000, and burned large sections of South Central Los Angeles. The National Guard rolled through the streets in armored vehicles. The uprising didn't reach Compton directly, but its consequences did, as certainly as if the fires had jumped the city line. White residents who had been uneasy but staying now left in waves. The process that had been gradual became a rush. Between 1960 and 1970, Compton went from 40% black to 65% black, and by the mid-1970s, the figure exceeded 75%. What had taken 15 years to start took 5 years to finish. When Cliff Williams moved to Compton from Houston in 1971, he was struck by what he found. He had never seen so many black business owners, so many black entrepreneurs in one place. It inspired him to start his own businesses. He would eventually own several, including 2 restaurants. Compton in the early 1970s was, for a real but brief period, a citadel of black economic and political power, a place where black families owned homes with real yards, ran stores on real commercial streets, elected their own representatives, and governed their own city. In 1969, Douglas Dollarhide was elected Compton's first African-American mayor, making the city one of the first in California with a black chief executive. 2 black and 1 Mexican-American member joined the school board that same year. For people who had spent generations fighting for a seat at the table, people whose parents had been turned away from neighborhoods, denied bank loans, harassed by police, and terrorized by white gangs, Compton looked like proof that the table could be built from scratch. The city built a new high school, Centennial High, to accommodate its growing student population. There was civic pride in those years, a genuine belief that Compton could become a model for black self-governance in America. But the table rested on a foundation that had already cracked. White flight didn't just change who lived in Compton. It changed how the city was funded. Small businesses closed or relocated. Sales tax revenue evaporated. The bonds that had been issued to rebuild downtown after the 1933 earthquake, remember those bonds, came due right in the middle of this transition, in the late 1960s and 1970s, when the city had the least capacity to absorb the payments. At the same time, high interest rates and a national recession hit homeowners hard. Predatory loans with balloon payments, sold disproportionately to the new black homebuyers by lenders who knew exactly what they were doing, began to come due. Families lost their homes. Property tax revenue fell. Vacancy rates climbed. Abandoned houses multiplied. And the neighboring cities made sure to put distance between themselves and the trouble. Compton Boulevard, remember, had once been the main artery linking the hub city to the wider region. Now the cities on either end of it wanted nothing to do with the name. The process would reach its conclusion in 1986, but the sentiment was already there in the 1970s. Compton was becoming a place that other places defined themselves against, not next to, against. The dream of black suburban homeownership in Compton didn't die in a single moment. It deflated slowly, like a tire with a nail in it, still rolling, but losing pressure with every block. Meanwhile, a pocket of old Compton persisted. Richland Farms, a neighborhood of roughly 500 homes on large lots in the southwest corner of the city, still allowed residents to keep horses, goats, and chickens. It was a remnant of the agricultural past, a place where, into the 1970s and 1980s, a person could saddle a horse and ride in the morning air, a few blocks from the expanding war zone. The Compton Cowboys, a group of black horseback riders who would later gain national attention, traced their roots to this tradition. The city wasn't all one thing, not ever, but the headlines only told one story. And then came the block that everyone knows about, Piru Street, a residential block in Compton, flat and sun-blasted like every other, no monument, no plaque. In 1969, a young man named Sylvester Scott had founded a neighborhood group called the Piru Street Boys, named for the street where they gathered. They weren't the Crips. That distinction matters. The Crips had been founded that same year in South Central by Raymond Washington and Stanley Tookie Williams, and they were expanding aggressively, absorbing smaller gangs, demanding allegiance, punishing resistance. By 1972, the Crips' reach had extended deep into Compton, and the Piru Street Boys were being squeezed. So Scott called a meeting. Representatives from several other non-Crip groups showed up. The L.A. Brims, the Bishops, the Athens Park Boys, others. They agreed to form an alliance. They chose a color, red, in opposition to the Crips' blue. They called each other Blood. Within a few years, this loose coalition had a name, the Bloods, and had grown into one of the 2 dominant gang networks in Los Angeles. The Piru Street Boys became the Pirus, the founding set, and Compton became the birthplace of one half of America's most notorious gang rivalry. The streets named after trees, acacia, poplar, maple, spruce, cedar, elm, gave their names to Piru sets that would eventually spread to cities across the country, from Norfolk, Virginia, to Atlanta to Newark. Fruit streets, too, plum, cherry, apple, peach, became gang territory names. The pleasant suburban nomenclature of Compton's original developers, who had named their streets to evoke orchards and shade trees and the good life in Southern California, was absorbed into a vocabulary of violence. Cedar Block Piru, Fruittown Piru, Treetop Piru. The names sounded almost pastoral if you didn't know what they meant. Still, for most of the 1970s, the gangs were a problem, but not yet the defining fact of life in Compton. What changed the city's trajectory irreversibly was a substance, not a rivalry: crack cocaine. In the early 1980s, cheap, smokable cocaine flooded into the neighborhoods of South Central and Compton, and it detonated like an economic bomb, one that created enormous profits for dealers, enormous demand among users, and enormous incentives for territorial violence. A single block in Compton, according to one former dealer, could generate $100,000 a week in crack sales. The stakes were so high that the penalty for losing a corner to a rival wasn't lost revenue. It was death. And the city that produced these statistics also produced, in the same years and sometimes from the same neighborhoods, Baseball Hall of Famers Ozzie Smith and Eddie Murray, NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle, actor Kevin Costner, filmmaker Ava DuVernay. Compton was never only one thing, but only one story got told. The numbers from this period are almost incomprehensible for a city of less than 100,000 people. In 1972, Compton had recorded 46 murders in a population of about 80,000, already the highest per capita murder rate in the country at the time, but the crack era made that look modest. By 1985, the annual toll was climbing toward 60. By 1991, it reached 87, 3 times the per capita murder rate of the city of Los Angeles. A 1982 survey by the Rand Corporation declared Compton a disaster area. A 1992 report by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office estimated that half of all black men between 21 and 24 in the county were affiliated with gangs, and Compton was the epicenter. Between 1985 and 2000, the city averaged 66 murders a year. In a 2-year-old shot dead in his front yard during a drive-by in 1989, in a 16-year-old killed with a semi-automatic while riding his bicycle the same year, the statistics found their human faces. The police response made things worse. The LAPD, which didn't police Compton directly but shaped the broader environment of South Los Angeles, deployed programs with names designed to intimidate. CRASH, Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums, Operation Hammer. These weren't community policing initiatives. They were paramilitary sweeps, search and seizure raids that treated entire neighborhoods as hostile territory, stopping young black men on the street, searching them, running their names, confiscating their property. By the LAPD's own admission, the sweeps criminalized entire communities. On a single weekend in 1988, Operation Hammer arrested 1,400 people in South Central, the vast majority of whom were released without charges. The message was clear. If you were young and black and lived in this part of Los Angeles, you were a suspect. In Compton itself, the city's own police department was struggling under the weight of corruption, underfunding, and the sheer scale of violence it was expected to contain with a force too small and too compromised to manage a city in crisis. Nobody expected to live very long. That's a line from Hodari Sababu, a former member of the South Side Crips who later, after serving 10 years in prison for drug trafficking, started a tour company that takes visitors through Compton's streets. He said that at the height of the crack era, shootouts happened weekly. Families slept in bathtubs because stray bullets came through walls. People who could afford to leave did. Those who couldn't stayed and endured. It was into this environment that 5 young men from Compton and the surrounding neighborhoods, Eric Eazy-E Wright, Andre Dr. Dre Young, O'Shea Ice Cube Jackson, Lorenzo MC Ren Patterson, and Antoine DJ Yella Caraby, formed a group and called it N.W.A. The initials stood for something unprintable. Eazy-E, the group's financial engine, was a former drug dealer who had made enough money on the streets to fund a record label, Ruthless Records, out of his own pocket. He was 19 years old. Their debut album, released on August 8, 1988, was called Straight Outta Compton, and it did something that no news report, no sociological study, no government survey had managed to do. It made the rest of America pay attention. The album wasn't the invention of gangsta rap. That credit belongs to earlier artists like Schoolie D and Ice-T. But it was the genre's detonation point. It sold over 3 million copies despite almost no radio airplay, driven entirely by word of mouth and the raw power of its content. One track in particular provoked a formal letter from the FBI's assistant director to the group's label, warning about the song's anti-law enforcement message, a distinction no other musical act had ever received. The album turned Compton into a symbol, not just of one city's problems, but of urban America's failures. and it did so by claiming the name with a ferocity that made it impossible to ignore. You could rename Compton Boulevard. You could not unname Straight Outta Compton. Here is the irony that no one planned. The photograph for the cover of N.W.A.'s first album, the 1987 release N.W.A. and the Posse, wasn't even taken in Compton. It was shot in an alleyway next to a Hollywood recording studio. The city that was being marketed to the world as the authentic heart of street life was, from the very beginning, also a performance. A real place transformed into a brand. The poverty was real. The violence was real. The police brutality was real. But the packaging of those realities into a sellable product happened in recording studios and boardrooms miles away from Piru Street. Compton was raw material, and the entertainment industry, located, as Josh Sides points out, just a short drive up the freeway, turned it into a commodity that could be sold to suburban teenagers from coast to coast. What the album's global fame obscured, and what almost no one outside the city noticed at the time, was that Compton was already in the middle of another demographic revolution. Between 1980 and 1990, the city's African American population declined from 73% to 66%, while its Latino population surged from 21% to 30%, a 131% increase. This was the beginning of a transformation as dramatic as the one that had turned Compton from white to black in the 1950s and 1960s. Latino families, many of them immigrants from Mexico and Central America, were drawn by the same thing that had drawn black families a generation earlier, affordable housing in a city that other people were leaving. By 2001, Latinos were the majority, at 57%. By 2010, they reached 65%. The city that the entire world associated with Black America was no longer majority black. The brand had frozen in 1988, but the city kept changing underneath it. Inside Compton, the early 1990s brought a convulsion. On April 29, 1992, a jury in Simi Valley acquitted 4 white LAPD officers in the videotaped beating of Rodney King, and Los Angeles erupted. The riots killed more than 50 people across the region and caused over $1 billion in damage. Compton, already staggering under its own weight of violence, was hit hard. Parts of the city were looted and burned. The businesses that had hung on through the crack years, the corner stores, the small shops along Compton Boulevard, were among the casualties. But something unexpected came out of the destruction: a truce. Members of the Crips and the Bloods, exhausted by a decade of killing, agreed to a ceasefire. It was fragile and imperfect, but it was real enough to bend the curve. Murder rates in Compton began to fall through the late 1990s, from the peak of 87 in 1991 to 48 in 1998, then lower still. The city's political leadership, meanwhile, was struggling with its own crises. Omar Bradley, elected mayor in 1993, pursued an aggressive redevelopment agenda. A new city hall at 205 South Willowbrook Avenue, the Crystal Park Hotel and Casino, hundreds of new housing units. But the city's finances remained precarious. The fall in crime wasn't fast enough, and the Compton Police Department's problems ran too deep. Allegations of corruption, excessive force, and institutional dysfunction had dogged the department for years. Officers were underpaid and undertrained. The department was small, far too small for a city with 65 active gangs and 10,000 documented gang members. In July of 2000, the 5-member city council voted 4-1 to disband the Compton Police Department entirely and contract instead with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Bradley led the vote. The Compton PD, formed in 1888, the same year the city incorporated, was gone after 112 years. The $12 million annual contract with the Sheriff's Department was, at the time, the most expensive among the 41 cities the department patrolled. By 2020, Compton was paying $22 million a year for sheriff's services, more per resident and per square mile than nearly any other city in the county. And the relationship was not smooth. In 2011, the City Council briefly voted to reestablish a local police force, but reversed course when the budget numbers came back. A $33 million deficit made it impossible, and the city had already spent $1.7 million in preparation before pulling the plug. The city that had once dreamed of governing itself was now paying a premium to be governed by someone else, and periodically discovering that the sheriff's deputies patrolling its streets came with their own problems, including allegations of excessive force and the persistent presence of what investigators would later describe as deputy gangs within the department. Compton's contribution to the music industry didn't end with N.W.A. Suge Knight, the imposing co-founder of Death Row Records, one of the most commercially successful and most notorious labels in hip-hop history, was an affiliate of the mob Piru, a blood set from East Compton. Knight hired members of several Compton Piru sets as bodyguards and enforcers for Death Row, blurring the line between the music business and the gang world so thoroughly that it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Death Row's artists included Dr. Dre after he left N.W.A., along with Snoop Dogg and Tupac Shakur. The label's implosion, marked by lawsuits, violence, Knight's eventual imprisonment, and the unsolved murders that haunted its orbit, played out in the national media for years. Compton was always in the background, the place that produced the people who made the music, that made the money, that fueled the chaos. And yet, even as the violence ebbed, the name's power persisted. In 1998, Compton still had an estimated 65 gangs and 10,000 gang members. The city's population in the 2000 census was about 93,000, meaning roughly 1 in 9 residents was a documented gang affiliate. The infrastructure of organized street violence had become as embedded in the city's landscape as its grid of modest ranch houses and the palm trees lining its boulevards. Guns were used in 91% of Compton's murders between 2000 and 2016, compared with a national average of 67%. The weapon of choice told the story of the market. Cheap handguns, plentiful and disposable, circulating through a community where they were easier to obtain than a steady job. What the name Compton means depends entirely on when you arrived at the conversation and who you are. To historians of Southern California's suburbs, it's one of the earliest, a farming village that became a bedroom community before the term existed. To students of civil rights, it's a case study in restrictive covenants and their aftermath. What happens when the walls go up, and what happens when they come down? To the black families who moved there in the 1950s and 1960s, it was the promised land, a real house with a real yard in a real city where you could be a real citizen. To Douglas Dollarhide and the generation of black politicians who followed him, it was a laboratory of self-governance. To the young men on Piru Street in 1972, it was home turf, the ground they would defend or die on. To Eazy-E and Ice Cube, it was a raw material, the place whose name became their art and their fortune. To the Paramount City Council in 1986, it was a word that needed to be scraped off a street sign before it could lower property values. To the Latino families who now make up nearly 3/4 of its population, it is simply the place where they live, raise their children, and go to work, a city whose global reputation bears almost no resemblance to their daily experience. The arc of Compton's story is not a simple rise and fall. It's a series of replacements. The Tongva people who inhabited the basin were replaced by the Dominguez family's Spanish land grant. The rancho was replaced by Griffith Compton's Methodist colony. The farmers were replaced by white suburban families. The white families were replaced by black families. The black families were, in significant part, replaced by Latino families. Each wave inherited the physical infrastructure of the previous one, the same 10 square miles, the same grid of streets, the same modest houses, but found a completely different city waiting for them because the money, the services, and the political power had been rearranged in the transition. The houses themselves, those post-war tract homes with their stucco walls and low roof lines, are the only constant. Built for one group, sold in panic to another, foreclosed from a third, rented to a fourth. The architecture didn't change. Everything else did. The bonds from 1933. That detail is easy to overlook, but it tells the whole economic story of Compton in miniature. The city borrowed money to rebuild after an earthquake. The rebuilt downtown thrived for 20 years under an all-white population that paid taxes, patronized local businesses, and supported city services. Then the white population left, taking its tax base and its businesses. The bonds came due in the late 1960s and 1970s, precisely when the city had the least capacity to pay them. The new residents, many of whom had been systematically denied wealth-building opportunities for generations, inherited the bill for a downtown that had been built to serve the people who abandoned it. If you wanted to design a system to ensure that a city would fail, you could hardly do better. Compton today is a different place from any of its previous incarnations, and different from its reputation. Crime has dropped by more than 70% from its peak. In 2013, Aja Brown, at 31, the youngest mayor in the city's history, was elected on a platform of economic revitalization. She helped broker truces between rival gangs, reducing the murder rate further. In 2015, there were just 15 murders, the lowest in modern memory, at a time when murder rates elsewhere in the country were climbing. The Community Redevelopment Agency, over the decades, transformed more than 1,500 acres of unused land into the Walnut Industrial Park, which houses distribution centers for companies like Nissan, Ralph's, and Xerox, the kind of large national and international corporations that a generation earlier wouldn't have considered a Compton address. The Metro Blue Line, later renamed the A Line, runs through the city, connecting it to downtown Los Angeles and Long Beach via the Martin Luther King Jr. Transit Center on Willowbrook Avenue. There is a shopping center with national retail chains, a development that, when it opened, gave what one reporter called a self-esteem boost to a city branded as poor and crime-ridden. For the first time in an election for mayor, a city official pointed out crime was not the issue. People were talking about development, about jobs, about schools. It is, by the standards of many American cities, an ordinary working-class suburb trying to stay solvent, its median household income around $78,000, its poverty rate around 15%, not prosperous, not destitute, but striving. But the name still carries all its weight. You can travel anywhere in the world, as historian Josh Sides has observed, and people still talk about Compton as if it were Compton in the early 1980s. The $5 tour buses that Hodari Sababu drives through Compton, Hood Life Tours he calls them, exist because tourists want to see the dangerous city from the album cover, and what they find instead are quiet residential streets, families on porches, kids on bicycles. The city exists in the global imagination as a frozen image, a place defined by a single decade, a single album, and a single set of statistics that have been out of date for a generation. Its current majority population, the one actually living there and paying taxes and sending children to schools, is largely invisible in the cultural shorthand. The city's population has quietly declined, from its peak of around 97,000 to roughly 91,000 today, as if it were slowly exhaling. The story of Compton is, in the end, the story of a name and what Americans do with it. Griffith Dickinson. Compton gave his name to a settlement. The settlement gave its name to a boulevard. The boulevard stretched 17 miles across 7 cities, and then, one by one, each neighboring city peeled the name away. Paramount in 1986, Gardena, Lawndale, Hawthorne, and Redondo Beach by 1989, until the boulevard existed only within the city limits of the place that bore it. The name that once reached across the map was confined to its source, not erased. That's the thing. Not erased, just contained. Reduced to the 10 square miles where it started, while everywhere else in the world, the same 4 syllables were louder than they'd ever been. Compton Boulevard still runs through Compton. It was originally called Main Street, the division line between north and south in the city's address system. If you stand on it today, near Willowbrook Avenue, you can see the Martin Luther King Jr. Transit Center, the light rail tracks, the low-slung commercial buildings. The street looks like 100 other streets in 100 other working-class suburbs across Los Angeles County. A car passes. A bus pulls to the curb. Someone crosses against the light. The street sign at the corner says what it has always said inside the city limits, what no one else wanted it to say, what 5 young men in 1988 made sure the entire world would never forget. Compton Boulevard. It only goes as far as Compton now.